podcast that you're listening to is being presented to you with the cooperation of the SJ Network. If you're a person who needs a publicist and you want to appear on podcasts, contact Stephen Joyner at s-j-network.com. Let's get on with the show.
Today's Season 8 finale guest on The Sherpa Screening Room is news anchor and author Jennifer Vaughn.
That sounds great. Did you know that I've been featured on the news several times?
You do realize that mug shots really don't count.
I was saying, I've never been on the news. But my picture is popular in the post office.
Attention, rebels of the Sherpalution. Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. We would like to give you a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial simply by heading to www.audibletrial.com/Sherpa. There are over 180,000 titles of audiobooks and podcasts, including this one, to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. And now, the one and only Mr. Bruce will lead you into the Sherpa Chalet. As a reminder, our award-winning customer service department is fully trained to ignore you and any of your silly questions.
Coming to you from Sherpa Chalet in beautiful downtown Mount Podcastia, it's time for entertainment interviews in the Sherpa Screening Room. Grab an aisle seat and a bucket of popcorn, but don't crunch too loud or you'll miss the show. Now, here's your host, Jim, the podcast Sherpa.
Hello, the rebels of the Sherpalution, and welcome to the Sherpa Screening Room, a presentation of Too Many Podcasts. And that would be hosted by me, Jim, the podcast Sherpa. Welcome to the show. And if you've tuned in today, guess where you are? You are at the Season 8 finale. Finale, Sherpa? How is this possible? I didn't hear anything else on Season 8. It's all there, folks. If you go to Sherpalution.com or listen to your favorite podcast apps, I promise you, every episode there, even all the way back from the beginning. You can catch all my other season finales as well. But you want to stick around for this one because this one is a good one. And my guest today is an author of a new book out called Made in Hollywood. And she's authored several other books. And not only is she an author, she is a news anchor in the state of New Hampshire who has spoken to and interviewed the last 6 presidents of the United States. So we got to talk a lot about the news and about her writing career as well. Her name is Jennifer Vaughn. I really enjoyed speaking with her, and I think you're going to enjoy hearing what she has to say. Give me a lot of real insight about the news and writing as well. So I don't want to hold you up any longer, folks. Let's have a listen in the Sherpa Screening Room to my interview with Jennifer Vaughn. Hello there, rebels, and welcome to the Sherpa Screening Room. My guest today has been a news anchor for over 20 years. She's up in New Hampshire, and she's also an author of several books, such as Legacy Girls, Echo Valley, Last Flight Out, and her latest at this time, Made in Hollywood, which is a story about actor Scott Morrow. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to get to know a whole bunch about her because she's a really fascinating person. Jennifer Vaughn has joined me right here. Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Hi, Jim. Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
It is a pleasure to have you. You were doing the news before you got into writing. Is that the way that it worked? Or were you a writer, an aspiring writer who got into the news?
No, you had it right the first time. So my 22-year career in news was the first big career I had. It was what I set my sights upon when I was in college and getting out of college. And then the writing came many years into my career, which if there are aspiring authors out there listening, I do think that it might behoove you to build some life experience into the arc of your writing. So when I thought I was many years in my news career, I gave it a go. And it wasn't something that I put any pressure upon myself about. I sat down to write one day. By the way, it's just a big tip for all aspiring authors. Just do it. Start one day, sit down and get it rolling. And I just wanted to see if I could. I grew up reading. I love to read. In the TV news business, I mean, we write copy. So I've been writing, but writing for a different way, in a different way for TV. which is completely different than book writing. But nonetheless, I write every single day. And a really great built-in factor about my news job is there's always a deadline. You have to turn around whatever you're working on that day because it needs to air. Your project needs to be done and it needs to be right and it needs to air. So there's no such thing as writer's block as I consider my world. And that comes with book writing, TV writing. You have to get something done. So just get words on paper, words on your computer. And that's how it really began with me. So TV news career first. Books, I wanted to give it a try, so I did. And now I have 6 books written, and I'm working on a 7th, which will release later on this year. So you just kind of keep going. But before you keep going, you just have to start. So that's always one of the first questions I get at a book event or any sort of author interest gathering is, geez, I have so many ideas in my head. How do I even organize? What do I do? And my advice is always the same, which is just start. You can always edit. You can circle back and fix and change, but just start. Get it out of your head, get it onto your journal, get it onto your computer, just start.
Some of the books that you've created, I mean, it's mostly been fiction up until the most recent one, but you get to incorporate a lot of real life into those fictional works.
Yes. So real life definitely has colored my writing. I have a lot of ideas that come from the scope of my TV world. For instance, in fiction writing, I have a couple that relate to presidential politics, more so the people behind the candidate, the people caught up in the whirlwind of politics. And I would stretch out stories based on that alone by observing these presidential candidates come through New Hampshire. But not just them, it's the people around them, the entourage, the families. How do they fit in? How do they make this work? How are they solely existing for the success of somebody that's not themselves? And, what are some of the pitfalls that they can run into? So a lot of that was a lot of my personal experience with my TV news job does in fact make its way into the pages of my books inevitably. It's what I know. It's what I see. Being a reporter and being out, at a crime scene or a horrific accident, or conversely, something wonderful like a Super Bowl, or, somebody gets a brand new house. I've covered all of that. So when you're out on the scene, inevitably you're there to take care of your task for the day, which is to translate that story into something that viewers will watch, and 3 hours from then or 2 hours from now, we're breaking news. They're watching it live with you. But you remember, of course, so you take it back and you think about, oh, the air smelled that way. This person looked that way. This person, I remember having a remarkable emotional response during our interview. So all of those things translate into my memories as the reporter or the anchor at the time. And then further, that can translate into how I set a scene when I write parts of my book. And it helps to enrich dialogue a lot of the time because I can reflect back on what it was like for me when I interviewed this person in that circumstance. So it kind of works almost in tandem. One career sort of feeds the next.
Now, as a reporter and as an anchor, I know you have to be pretty objective when you're presenting the news. Was there ever anything that happened that really just kind of melted your heart or made you angry and you kind of had to not show it on camera?
That happens more often than you would know. Any time there's something that's particularly emotional, that's impactful, perhaps in the next town over from where you live, if you do local news, or on the national scale, something that's large and impacts the entire country. And, right now, just think of all the coverage coming out of Ukraine, and we see that nightly. And the video is intense. The stories are intense. The information is intense. So my job is not to reflect to the viewers what I'm thinking about it. You can imagine what I think about it. I think the same thing you think about it. Mm-hmm. But my job is just to be as stoic as I can and as professional as I can as I bring you all of the information that you need to know as the viewer. And then my job is to bring it to you with impartiality and professionalism to make you responsible for your own choices and thoughts about the matter that I'm presenting to you. But believe me, just today, we're profiling some runners as they get ready for, what's coming up. As I talked to you, it's a Boston Marathon. It's a big deal. There was a big attack on the Boston Marathon several years back. Everybody around here was touched by that. So it's impactful listening to why they're running, who they're running for. Somebody might have lost somebody and they run in their memory. So every night between the top of the news, which is the breaking news sometimes, or the biggest stories of the day, right down to, maybe a teacher doing something extraordinary for her class, or a child getting over an illness. Everything impacts you. Some hits harder than the others, but everything impacts you, and that's, sometimes that's really difficult. I will be honest. It's really difficult to just shut your brain off and shut down and go home to your family and your house and the quiet, but you don't forget about it. You certainly have it live in your head forever, particularly in, TV being such a visual platform. Obviously, the images are up close. So that can sometimes be the hardest part of the job, is to sort of let the job be when you leave the building.
Now, being in New Hampshire, of course, New Hampshire, for those who don't know, who don't live here, always where the first presidential primaries are. And you say that you've seen your share of, and met and interviewed your share of presidents and presidential candidates.
So think of, I've been here for 4 cycles now. So think of every presidential candidate in all of those 4 cycles combined. And so every candidate and every presidential Democrat, Republican debates, every presidential incident, let's say, that involves the election and picking who will be the candidate for each party comes through New Hampshire since the year 2000. So George W. Bush, I interviewed George H.W. Bush and his wife, Barbara, the former president, interviewed former President Bill Clinton, former President Barack Obama, former President Donald Trump, current President Joe Biden. Hillary Clinton, Sarah Palin, everybody that you can think of, name, remember, they've come through New Hampshire and they've sat down with us. And I've had plenty of time with them. And some stories are remarkable. And then some stories are And as are, they are people. So it was always one of my objectives, even as a young reporter coming up and having access to these candidates, was to just bring them to the viewers as the viewers would want to see them, which is they're regular people, ask them questions that, they need to deliver the answers to in order for the viewers, in turn, the voters, to consider them as a worthy candidate and representative of the country. So when you look at your job in that way, I treat everybody the same as they come through. And sometimes it's a sort of a gregarious type, big personality. Sometimes one of the candidates could be tired and it's just a very quick interview. We've seen full spectrum of it all. And behind the scenes, again, which is what a lot of my, a couple of my books are based on, is behind the scenes action behind these candidates, the inside story of politics. That always fascinated me just as much as the candidate himself or herself. Because it's the underbelly of the campaign. It's the people who grind every single day, and they're putting the information out, and they're taking care of the candidate, and they're making sure that the candidate remains unblemished and prepared. And imagine the weight of that world on your shoulders.
In the presidents that you've met, is there anyone that stands out in particular?
My very first one, which is way before I even got into TV, I was doing radio at the time. I was an intern at a radio station down in Providence, Rhode Island, and they sent me out to attempt to interview President Clinton as he was coming through. He was making a stop in Rhode Island for something, and they never thought I would get the job done. Because first of all, I was an intern. I wasn't even a real reporter at the time, but they threw me this job just probably to see if I could even do it. So the joke was going to be on me. But the interesting thing is I actually got him on tape and I brought it back to them and I said, okay. And they looked at me like I had 4 heads. They were like, what do you mean? I said, well, I have your interview for you. So here you go. And they clearly didn't expect me to actually succeed in that quest, but I did. So I remember that because I was, so young. Oh my gosh, I had just graduated from college and, getting myself into this industry with that enormous assignment. So that was a big heady experience, right? If you think about it. Mm-hmm. And then since I've been up here in TV, I have a couple of behind the scenes moments with the candidates, a couple of, private conversations I've had with the candidates. And a lot of the times, once they come through 6, 7, 8, 9 times, they would begin to ask, how are your kids doing by name? They would remember my kids' names. They might compliment me on my shoes or, ask, how are you doing? What's new? What's going on? So it became It always does. It's the tradition of the campaign trail in New Hampshire. It always, you break barriers a little bit and you get to know them as people and you get to know the people around them as people and who they are, which is not to say there's not always the line of professionalism that you have to mark, right? You represent and you respect that. But, when you become so familiar with them, you kind of can let their guard down a little bit. So I've had great interactions with everyone. I will tell you a funny story about former President Trump. He came through first in 2012 when he was starting to think about running. Of course, he didn't until 2016.
Right.
But during that time, he didn't like to shake hands. And we had a conversation with him about that because he's a bit of a germaphobe. He was coming through our newsroom and we had some time at this big table where we have our afternoon meetings at. And he stopped there and was talking to them. And we were all explaining to him, you're going to have to get over that. If you truly want to run at some point, you're going to have to get over that part because people are going to want to touch you and they're going to want to shake your hand and they want to kiss you and they're going to want to hug you. And you've really got to make a point to break that barrier of yours because that is not going to fly with voters. And sure enough, by the next time he really truly became a candidate by 2016, he was doing some more handshaking than he ever did the first time when he came around in 2012.
Did he keep a big bottle of sanitizer in his jacket pocket or something?
Yeah. And his team does too. They're people are quirky. And even if you're running for president, you're still quirky so that your team has the job of knowing your quirks and being prepared for them. It's
got to be a real unique feeling when you're getting to speak to these people on a personal level, and then you have to report on them, whether it's something spectacular that they did or something that might be scandalous.
True. And they know that. They know that's part of the deal. I don't believe in being adversarial for the sake of being adversarial. I think that there's a that professional line that you must stay behind when you're the journalist and they're the candidate. Which doesn't mean, though, again, by the 18th time they come through, you're not greeting each other like, oh, hey, how are you doing? Are you tired? There was one, this past cycle, Bernie Sanders was coming through a lot. And we've known Bernie through the years. He's senator from next door in Vermont, and he's run now, three times, and won the New Hampshire primary twice, which is a big feat. And he comes through all the time, and it was getting towards the end, and the primary was imminent, and he came through one day. He had a terrible cold. He lost his voice, and I remember thinking, "Oh, Bernie, gosh, you probably just should be home in bed, having some chicken noodle soup tonight, and going to bed." And he's like, "I know. I wish I could. Don't report that." So it's like that kind of an instance in which they can be human in front of you, when you're not going to jump all over it and try to get it out there as breaking news. That doesn't fly, at least not with me. And it shouldn't with journalists, at large. It really shouldn't. They're just, at the end of the day, you're there to cover policies, and in the terms of when they're candidates, you need to cover their spin, how they're reacting to voters, what voters think about them. You cover all your bases. But it's also okay to say, oh gosh, Senator, I hope you feel better, or something like that. And it keeps it nice and professional and tidy.
In the time that you've been doing the news, what's the biggest change that you've seen? What I've kind of seen is a lot of politicizing. And we don't talk politics on this podcast, so I'm not going to debate you or anything like that. But I noticed that even with every little thing that comes up, it seems that it just becomes so polarized.
I'm not going to debate politics either with you, but I'm not going to tell you you're wrong. I agree. And I find it unfortunate, and way too much opinion has filtered into what should be an impartial presentation of facts, events, and incidents, with the opportunity for viewers or listeners to make their own decisions. And I find that deeply unfortunate, and it violates every reason you'd become a journalist in the first place. And it really should violate your personal trust in yourself to do your job the right way. I think as far as how the industry has changed, that is a big part of it. I think that public trust has waned because of that. In local news, which is what I do, with the exception of when there's a national interest story in presidential politics, and then we're pretty much national, sometimes international with the debates that we do too. But in local politics, there's still more of a grip on impartiality. We have the availability of all parties, in our home, in our towns, in our state. And therefore, it is our objective nightly to make sure that the viewers are seeing, all sides of it. If it has anything to do with, say, for instance, like town meeting or laws, rules, government, every side is represented, and but you do need to make sure. And that's where sort of the cable outlets, or sometimes even the network news, they could get a little loose with that. Mm-hmm. But local news still maintains that grip on making sure that if we're presenting a story to you and it has the impact on you, your family, your tax bill, your streets, your roads, your government, your laws, then both sides, the pros, the cons, and everything in between is presented to you, so that when the story is done, you should know every angle and enough information that you're able to produce your own thoughts on it.
I remember having a conversation with a friend a while back, and he was talking with, I think, his brother, and it came up in the conversation. He said, he says, people don't say anymore, oh, we'll just have to agree to disagree. Mm. It's not that, well, you're wrong and I'm right. And, and that's what monopolizes social media as well. It just kind of overtakes everything and kind of takes the fun out of it in a way.
I think, and even worse than that, it becomes very sad because relationships are broken over this kind of thing, where people look at each other and they say, I might have been friends with you for 25 years, but because you see this event, this moment, this political discourse in such a way, I can no longer have you in my life. That's what is so unfortunate about how far we've come. I hope that changes. I do think the access to instantaneous information via Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and all the social media has just planted that awful seed of divisiveness. And you find strangers more appealing than people you might have grown with, just because they might have a different opinion than you have, or they a different way. And that's one of, I think, the great tragedies of, the technological wave of instant communication and access to strangers in such a way that every opinion is posted in real time. We've lost sort of the genuineness of relationships. And I do hear you on that. And I think, unfortunately, people, the media, that it has had a big role in the deterioration of that. And I don't disagree entirely. Yeah. I've been in this industry because I'm passionate about it, but I understand where the public might consider that. And I don't think that it's unreasonable to suggest that either.
Let's switch gears and we'll talk about your writing career for a little bit.
Sounds great.
You got started with Last Flight Out. That was your first book.
So that was my very first book. And this was that time in my life in which I said, I've loved to read my whole life. I have stories percolating in my head. I have experience with presidential candidates. I've seen the behind the scenes. Well, what can I do here? So I put a book together, and you never know. It was my first time doing it. Mm-hmm. So I had some success, and it got published, and I did a lot of events, and people were very gracious. And the most exciting part about the release of Last Flight Out was about a year and a half later, I was invited out to the daytime Emmy Awards in Beverly Hills, and it was included in a swag bag for all the celebrities who came through. They grabbed Last Flight Out, my debut novel, and that was a trip. That was really fun and unexpected, and a really great experience. At the time, I took my mom and my daughter, who was a lot younger, and we had quite a trip. From there, I was like, okay, I like this writing books thing. All right, let's see what else I can come up with. So from there, I had a series in which the main character is a TV reporter out in Los Angeles in the first book, and then she comes out to New Hampshire in the second book. And then Echo Valley came out, and that too is a bit of the behind the scenes of a presidential campaign. This is a young single mother hairdresser who stumbles into a presidential scandal, and then they need to shut her up before she can start spouting about what she has seen and what she knows about this particular candidate. And then after that, I did pivot into narrative nonfiction, which is what my newest book is, Made in Hollywood. There was one prior to that, my 2019 release, Shadow Kid, which was how I even moved into this new realm of sort of writing about real life and somebody else's real life, which is very different from concocting fiction on your own, out of your own mind, mm-hmm. and doing your own research, coming up with your own plot, your own ending and all of that. So a gentleman reached out and suggested, I have a peculiar and interesting life story. Might you be interested? I do see this as a book. Now, in my TV line of work, we hear about this all the time. And we do have to decipher, okay, what's really fascinating and might be really worthwhile to bring to the attention of our viewers, and what might not be, but yet, special to the person who's lived it. Well, this man blew me away with the life that he has had. It is spectacular and tragic and miraculous and unbelievable events. And it involves, shady government entities. And he came by and I met him and spent about 4 hours together on that initial day. And he did produce pieces of evidence, which I asked for, just to say, okay, how do I know you're not spinning this tale out of the ether? And once I had all of the components of this man's story together, I said, I must write this book. So that was my first foray into narrative nonfiction, which basically translates into you read a book in story form. It reads like a regular story, like a fiction, but this is 100% real. So from here, that release, Shadow Kid, this gentleman that it's about became a very, very dear friend of mine. And we're very, very close. And because of that, he said, I know this guy. Now, they have Hollywood roots together. So they both have Hollywood circles and Hollywood mutual friends and entertainment business. So he said he's been thinking about writing his life story, but he wants a writer removed from Hollywood, somebody who doesn't really live out there and work out there. And would you be interested in talking to him? And at this point, I'm like, sure, I would love to. And then he started telling me about him. Oh, he's a little boy back in the day. You might know him from the movie Peyton Place, which rang bells for me. That was the biggest one. He said, well, he was in that. He was little Joey Cross. He was an A-list child actor. Marilyn Monroe was a buddy of his, a tight friend, like an older sister. So I went and discussed this with Scott now, as he's known. Little Scotty Morrow was the child actor, Scotty. Now he's Scott, and he's a grown man. He's an older gentleman in his 70s. And we hit it off quite well. And I said, listen, you need to be comfortable with my writing style and how I work and how you would want this to work. And we just forged a really great relationship. And through that, we created Made in Hollywood. So I wrote it. We went chapter by chapter most of the time. And he approved on, what I was sending him. The real critical component of bringing Scott's story to life was the fact that when he was even a little boy, he and his mom both, who basically served as his manager, kept journals, and they were prolific in these journals, like pouring out scenes of the days that they had just lived, what the movie set felt like, who they were with, what they saw, all of that nitty gritty stuff, right? That really ingrains itself into recreating a life. So he would share with me all of the information from his journal and his mom's journal, all of the pictures to tell the story. I would dig into all of the old movies and all of the old episodes that he was in, and I would watch them over and over and over again. And I really felt that at the time I was connecting to the little boy, even though he was a grown man and we were working on the story about his life. In my mind, I knew him as the little boy. And I fell in love with his mom, who was shrewd and wise and brave and taking on this industry as a woman in the 50s and the 60s to help navigate not just her son Scotty's career, but he had an older brother at the time who was also in the industry. And they became known as what are A-list child actors. So the go-to kids that directors would want in their productions. And this crosses movies and television. They did it all as little tiny boys in Hollywood, and their mom was right by their side.
Yeah, I would tell our listeners, in addition to checking out Jennifer's book, Made in Hollywood, look up Scott Morrow on IMDb, and especially if you're a little bit older and you're familiar with a lot of the shows from the 50s and 60s, he was on probably at least 90% of what was on your TV stations.
That's no joke. From the movies that he was in to the television shows and all of the big Westerns of the day. He was in Toughest Gun and Tombstone, aside George Montgomery, all of these wild tales. We dedicate about three and a half chapters just to Peyton Place alone, because the recollection of his experience on that set in both Camden, Maine, which is just an hour or so, hour and change away from me here in New Hampshire on the Northeast coast, and all of the stories back in LA, because they shot in these two locations and Simi Valley. And And what this little boy, think 8, 9, 10 years old, what he had to go through to even secure the role was intense and really challenging, really, really challenging. Not just, showing up for an audition, but then showing up for the full audition with the lights and the actress playing, the character next to you, and running lines and then getting called back and then waiting 2 weeks and then sometimes a month and not knowing. There was a time during the auditioning process for Peyton Place that his mom, Toby, did say to his agent, I feel badly for the first time in my son's career that he's going through this in terms of the wait, the not knowing, the getting called back, the whittle down of all of the young candidates that they were looking for to cast this role. Mm-hmm. That was one of the harder times, actually. It turned out to be a pivotal moment in his career, but yet it was one of the harder times for her in managing him, because it was so intense for a little boy to go through. But he soared through it, not just that critical, month and a half that they spent toiling over who was going to play him, ultimately getting the role. And then actually executing the job, far away from home, he was on a whole other coast, and just a child at the time, opposite Lana Turner. Imagine, she was one of the biggest stars of the day. Mm-hmm. And they were on the same movie sets and the same scenes. And what he was able to accomplish in the span of these childhood years in which little kids are not doing things like this. It's a recollection of the experiences that are so unique that you really don't hear too much about. And then, as we carry forth and we expand into him as a young adult and then a working adult, and he pivots into this new world of photography and then becomes prolific at that too. And then he's a young man, and then he's a grown man, and he's found love. And then there are tragic circumstances that befall him and real life-changing events. But the real magical part of his experience in Hollywood is that it never tainted him. He came out of it unscathed, and he came out of it still a better person than he went into it, which is not always what you can say about these really young and vulnerable child actors. So he's rare in that respect. Very, very rare.
Yeah, and probably back then, too, it was even more different for kids of that age as opposed to the kids who are on television today as well. They have a lot more protections and legal rights and all of that. I find it was interesting that both him and his mother had the presence of mind to keep a journal of everything.
Yes, I find that interesting too, because where would we be had they not?
Right.
I don't think we'd be talking about the book in such detail as we do, especially as I rebuilt dialogue. Dialogue is a huge part of these narrative nonfictions, even though you weren't there. I wasn't there in 1956. I mean, we weren't even born yet. I didn't know how things transpired on the set with Diane Varsi and Hope Lang, and where they're on Peyton Place, and Grace Metalius, the author of Peyton Place, is stalking around unhappy with how, her red hot book is being sanitized into something that she's not completely thrilled with. But he was there. After a day on set, he and his mom both would go back and record their thoughts, their emotions of the day, what they saw, what they remembered. So the compilation of these memorable moments they unfold in real time when you read somebody's journal, because it was taken in real time. It was what they remembered in that moment. So the journals were critical in recounting how this book came together and everything we needed to properly tell the story.
I hope to actually have Scott on the show in the near future. But earlier we were talking, and you were saying, I think you kind of dropped the hints before, about his relationship with Marilyn Monroe. I thought that was really a sweet story. If you could kind of relay that.
Sure. Yes, it's lovely. It's sweet. It's genuine. It was a true friendship. When Scotty was a toddler, he and his brother auditioned for a role with Marilyn. At the time, it was for Lux soap. which was the brand of a soap. It was a popular soap, and it was a commercial, probably a print commercial. I'm not sure if it was a TV commercial yet, but so they auditioned. They were among a bunch of kids that came in and auditioned, and they did not get the role. It ended up going to a pair of twin girls, which Toby, their mom, was not thrilled about because she really thought they had a good shot at landing that role. But that was with Marilyn. So that was the first time. He was but a baby, practically. And then his brother, Brad, worked with Marilyn on Monkey Business, I believe. So they were running in the same circles. So then when Scotty was under contract with 20th Century Fox during the time when he shot Peyton Place and another movie, Affairs to Remember, Marilyn was also under contract with 20th Century Fox. So how they did it back then, and may still do, I don't know. When they set the slot, which is where all the actors would go in between their shoots or their call times, and they would have some time to relax and just settle down. They would do it in alphabetical order. So Scotty Morrow was placed right next to Marilyn Monroe, surely by alphabetical order. Their trailers were right next to each other. So then they had constant exposure to each other, but it wasn't movie type. It was friendship type. For instance, they would have drumstick ice creams all together. The Good Humor bus would roll through, and it was like like an ice cream man would come through, and Marilyn would always treat Scotty and his mom, Toby, to drumsticks. And that was her favorite too. So they would sit around outside just on these, fold up chairs outside of the trailers and chat about stuff, movies or family, or Marilyn liked to confide a lot in Scotty's mom. So if she had a particular concern about something, she would like to talk it out oftentimes with Toby. She was always very, very kind. She was sweet. She loved kids, which might not have always translated, as she was known as just the uber star of her time, this glamazon. She loved kids. In fact, when Scotty was young, he was over at what's now Cedars-Sinai, but back in the day, it was known as something different. And Marilyn had contributed to a whole wing. She always came in and supported the kids. And sometimes she would drop in and visit them, the kids who were stuck in the hospital. So she had heard that Scotty was sick one time and he was in the hospital. She made a special point to get there and just to drop in and say hello to him and check in and say, hey, I want you to feel better, but I'm here to see you today. And there's that picture. Toby captured that picture that night. And that's one of the pictures that you can see in this book, among many, many others of his time on the sets and among all the other stars. But that picture is very sweet. It's Marilyn in this lovely black dress leaning over Scotty in his bed, just kind of caressing his cheek, which she was known to do because she loved him that way. When he was 16 and aging out, no longer really a child actor, he would drive to his own shows at that point. He was taping My Three Sons and driving himself to the set. His mom didn't go along with him anymore all the time. Before that, she was with him right by his side. As he grew up, he wanted some space and, had some maturity and responsibility, then he would start to go by himself. So around that time, Scotty was thinking about, I'm in high school. I want to start to do other things. There's a bigger world here, but he was still attached to the industry. So Marilyn was, in the process of basically decomposing in her personal life and in her career, but she had put together thoughts on what she wanted to be a trilogy. And this would be under Marilyn Monroe Productions. And she had started to circle in some screenwriters and had some ideas on casting. And she did reach out to Scotty's agent, and she asked for him by name to appear in one, two, or three of this unnamed trilogy project that she was working on at the time. And the agent, his name was Frank, couldn't have been more excited, but Toby, being so wise and knowing her so well, actually had reservations about attaching her son to something that she was not sure would ever get made. She was so concerned about the decline of Marilyn that she wasn't sure that it was real. And one of the most poignant conversations that they have in the book, as he's aging out as a child actor, but still now Marilyn has interest in him, is her explanation of why she's not thrilled about this inquiry and why she's not 100% sure it would ever get made. And it was a lovely conversation between the two of them, because she could be very honest about her concerns, and Scotty could be very honest about his genuine affection and love for Marilyn and how excited he felt about being able to be an adult on screen next to her, no longer just the little kid that they shared ice creams together. He had potentially the chance to act opposite her as this really talented young man. And unfortunately, within the next month, Marilyn was gone. And it was extremely impactful for both Scotty and Toby. They were devastated.
It's interesting that, you have these kind of stories and that he was smart enough to save them, because these are probably things that most people would probably never even know of. It would just kind of get buried in history. And then here's a guy who was a child actor at the time, and he's giving you this special scoop, and also kind of demystifying an icon as well, making her seem like just a regular person, just like they were. And it kind of runs parallel to what you do now with reporting the news, that you're dealing with world leaders and power brokers and all that, and they're just regular people, whether on or off camera. When
they're around me, and conversely, when Scotty was around the super uber stars of the day, we each had a role and a job, right? So my task when I'm interviewing a presidential candidate is to make sure that I get enough viable video and viable questions and viable answers that I can then turn that into what my viewers need to see that night. So that's my task. That's my only job. I can't consider them stars. I can't consider them, powerful. I just have to consider them my job at the time. And it was the same thing for Scotty, which he just seemed to know intrinsically. I don't know how a child does, but he seemed to get this, that his role in that big movie opposite that huge star was what he needed to execute. It wasn't sort of looking around googly-eyed at everybody around him. It was making sure that he showed up prepared, well-rested, knew his lines. And that's where his mom came in too, because she would drop the hammer and make sure that both of her boys were in school as often as they needed to be. They were attending either public school or studio school, as they would have. California state law did mandate that these kids had to attend some sort of, studio school. So they would have tutors brought in so that they kept up. Mm-hmm. And Scotty was even a grade ahead, because they had such great tutors for him on set that sometimes he tested out of a grade and they would just jump him up a grade. It is pivotal in your role, whether it's, a TV journalist or a child actor, that you understand your role. Your job is this, and then you lay it out. So the only thing you need to accomplish that day is you get your job done. And then you can kind of come back around and think about it after, but only after it's done. That's at least how I've always approached, handling a presidential candidate or a big nationally televised presidential debate, or, when they're presidents and the presidents come back to New Hampshire, which happens all the time. Mm-hmm. That's how I've always approached it. Is like there's a separateness that has to exist in order for me to execute my task. And then once it's over, I can appreciate it for what it just was, which was a really high value experience.
Now, we want to also mention to people that you do have a website where people can find out about your books.
Yes. It's jvwrites.com, and that will link you right to my books and a couple of pictures from years past and some of the wonderful people that I've had the chance to meet, and a little bit more about me.
Yeah, and this lady's very humble right now. I mean, she's been nominated for a lot of awards. You actually were the recipient of the Edwin R. Morrow Journalism Award.
Yes, so our team has we've been granted a lot of those due to hard work, diligence, and making sure that you work with integrity.
And is there anything coming up in the future, or are you right now just kind of taking a breather between books?
No breathers. No, you just got to keep going. So my next book is fiction. So I return to my fiction roots, and it will probably be coming out either later this summer, probably summertime. I don't have a release date yet, but I'm working. I just sent in my final edits on that today. So my heart, I love these narrative nonfictions. They're a lot of fun to do. A lot of my heart remains in fiction because I get to control the endings.
That's always a plus. I mean,
yes.
You don't have to read the ending off a teleprompter. It's right from Jennifer.
Yes, and I can dole out justice as I see fit.
That's always a good plan.
I think so anyway.
Okay, so we've been talking to Jennifer Vaughn. Please check out her new book called Made in Hollywood. And if you're in New Hampshire, you can actually see her on the nightly news as well. Jennifer, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Oh, totally my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
We're on that internet thingy at Sherpalution.com.
A super special, extraordinary word of thanks to today's guest, Jennifer Vaughn. Make sure you check out her book, Made in Hollywood. And if you go to her website, you can see the other books that she's created as well. And as I said earlier, this is the season 8 finale. So those of you who are familiar with the show know what happens next. What happens next, Sherpa? I'll tell you. If you come back next week, you will hear our season 8 wrap up. And this is where we acknowledge all our guests and we talk about what's going on. We will have some Sherpa suggestions and we will have some Sherpa samples because I've been listening to lots of podcasts and I want to tell you all about them. And I hope you enjoyed that. And if you are following me on social media at Sherpalution, on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, you can send me suggestions for Sherpa samples if I haven't sampled it already. I've been going at a pretty quick pace, folks, and I think you'll enjoy it. And if you enjoy this show, speaking of enjoying things, why not go over to iTunes or Spotify and please leave the show a 5-star review and write some nice things about the show, even if you have to lie a little bit, you know. But anyway, we will be back with the season 8 wrap up next week. And the following week, we will be kicking off season 9 with a wonderful guest. Of course, the wonderful guests. They were on this show. Where else would they come from, right? All right. We're going to get out of here. Mr. Bruce, you get to take a little bit of a breather, sir. So for now, I say to you all, Viva la Sherpalution. Bye, Rebels.
Thanks for listening to the Sherpa Screening Room. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast. I'm Mr. Bruce, and this has been a Sherpalu Studios production. Viva la Sherpalution!